I could be dead so young, and my poor family would have to watch that. And so I knew I had to get sober. It was life or death. And I did. So that was June of 2011. I had my last drink. And that's, for me, that's amazing. I mean, that's a miracle. And that's the gift of this story, is that Patty's death ultimately gave me such a better life.
Who am I?
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 This is Who Am I, Really? A podcast about adoptees that have located and connected with their biological family members. I'm Damon Davis, and today you're going to meet Pippa, who called me from California. Pippa grew up in a wonderful Irish family where she and her brother were supported and loved. When her brother's birth mother found him, it catalyzed Pippa's desire to return to Ireland to find her birth family. In reunion, Pippa found a birth mother who had suffered a lot of loss in her young life, a birth father whose alcohol consumption made her uncomfortable, and when it seemed like her journey was over, a huge secret was revealed out of nowhere. This is Pippa's journey. Pippa is originally from Ireland. She told me that in 1971, her adoptive parents got married but quickly realized they couldn't have children. So, her adoptive mother mentioned exploring adopting a child to her adoptive dad. They never discussed it again until 8 years later when they were walking home from a pub, and Pippa's dad asked,
"Hey, do you remember years ago we talked about adoption? Do you think maybe you want to get the ball rolling on that?"
Pippa's mom told Pippa she couldn't tell whether it was the night of drinking at the pub or if his interest was genuine in wanting to adopt a child, so she didn't do anything still. When Pippa's dad asked again about adopting a child a few days later, her mom knew he was ready for children. Her mom contacted the adoption agency, set things in motion, and Pippa's brother, who is a year older than herself, was adopted. Pippa's parents were thrilled with their son and decided to adopt a second child, Pippa, and the thrill of growing their family continued with her. The Irish economy was declining in the 1980s, so people were moving to England and to the United States to find work. Pippa's mother had a sister who lived in California, so their family started a new life on the left coast of the U.S.
So growing up, we always knew we were adopted. It was explained to us at a very young age before we could really comprehend it. And I always dreamed about finding my birth parents. I always kind of fantasized about what they would be like. And I definitely pictured my mother like Julia Roberts. That was in my head, but I never really thought about my birth father too much. And I suppose that's because he was sort of vaguely mentioned in my adoption paperwork. And my parents let me see that from a young age. And it really just gave a brief description of my mother and then a even smaller description of my father. But when my brother turned 18, he received a letter from Ireland from the adoption agency. And that letter, I remember it coming in a brown envelope, and we just knew immediately. We knew what it was. And the letter said that his parents had, they had him at a young age. They were about 17. And they stayed together. And they married, and they had 3 more children. And they were very anxious to find him. So they didn't wait. As soon as he turned 18, they contacted the adoption agency. So I was about 17 and my brother was 18. And I just remember him reading that letter and his eyes were just huge. And he looked at me and he said, "Pippa, I have 2 brothers and a sister." And he just could not believe, we never kind of thought about parents staying together. So it was quite a gift for him. And, it was interesting because he never really talked about it growing up, where I was the one that was a lot more vocal. And I remember when we were reading the letter, I sat down to read it on my own, and my mom came over and she just started rubbing my shoulder. And she knew immediately that, I was thinking, God, will this ever happen for me? And she came over and she just started rubbing my shoulder and she said, "You'll get your letter, pet. You'll get your letter." And, I was really excited for Hugh, my brother, and worked out really well because I don't know that he would have ever sought them out. And so this letter said, you can respond, please tell us about yourself. And, the adoption agency would pass that letter on to his family. And they specifically said, please don't include any identifying information such as your telephone number, your address. And I remember Hugh writing back, and I helped him select some photos, and he had just finished high school, so it was kind of fun to pick out his nice senior portraits, and it was exciting to be a part of that. And Hugh said, "I don't care. I'm going to put in my information, my address, my phone number." He said they can cut it out if they want to. And so he did. He wrote his phone number, his address, and so that letter was sent to the adoption agency in Ireland, and then it was sent on to his family. And they did actually cut out where he had written his phone number and address. So his mother was out in the country in Ireland. They lived in Leitrim, and she received the letter, and she was delighted. I mean, that was the first time they saw his face, his picture, and they knew that he was really open to meeting them. So at the time, his father was a carpenter, and he was doing a big job in New York. So his mother sent the envelope to New York, and his father is working on this building up in New York, and he is showing a friend of his, and he's looking at one of the photographs, and he flips it over to see if there was anything written on the back. And although there was nothing written on the back, what he did see was an imprint, and he held it up to the sun, and the light caught it in just a way that he said, "Jesus, I think I have his telephone number."
Wow.
And so they had cut out the number, but the imprint was still there. So he called his wife in Ireland and said, "I think I've got the number." And she said, "Ring him immediately." So I was at home one day, and this big, thick Irish accent calls looking for Hugh. And I said, "Oh, no, he's not home at the moment." And he said, "Oh, okay, I'll ring back. Okay, okay." And I said, "No, no, no, don't hang up. Is this Mick?" And he said, "It is, yeah." And I said, "Jesus, Mick, this is Pippa." And we spoke for probably half an hour. And then my mom spoke to him. And then my dad came home and he spoke to him. And as soon as my dad started speaking to him, I could hear the both of them laughing. And Dad said, "Jesus, Mick, I mean, you're in New York. You're halfway here. Come out for the weekend." And Mick agreed. And so poor Hugh, by the time he arrived home, we said, "Well, so Mick rang. I talked to him. Mom talked to him. Dad talked to him. Also, he's coming on Friday." And Hugh said, "Jesus Christ," like he was not prepared. And it was amazing. Mick came and spent the weekend with us, and it was just surreal. And by the time Mick left, I remember he handed Hugh an envelope full of cash, and he said, "Whenever you're ready, come to Ireland. They're all dying to meet you." So Hugh booked himself a trip, and he went out. He met his mother, his sister, his two brothers. And I mean, the similarity between all of them, it's mind-blowing.
Wow.
So that was quite an experience. And they're from this tiny little village in Leitrim. And, everybody's so nosy in these little villages. But his mother, Mary, said, "Now don't say a word. Everyone will be so curious to see who you are. Just say nothing." And so they all walked into the pub one evening, and, every head turned, and everyone said, "Jesus Christ, who's this big, tall American lad who looks just like you?" And they said, "Oh, just a friend." And of course, it was their child, it was so obvious, but he was just welcomed into that family immediately. And the nice thing is that kind of got me motivated. And so as soon as I could, I moved back to Ireland. I just bought a one-way ticket. And at the time I was 19, and I said, I'm just going to see what I can discover. If I find them, I find them. If I don't, I can come home.
That's unreal.
And
Let
so
me
it was.
pause you for a quick second there.
Sure.
So
Sure.
let me, just for fact check, how old are you and Hugh when this moment happens for Hugh?
Hugh was 18,
Right.
and I was 17.
Wow. So you are so close.
I was very
Wow.
close.
What did you think when your mom said, "You'll get your letter"?
I think at the time I was just trying to be happy for him, but of course my heart just dropped and I thought, "Oh, he never talked about this. He never wanted it." And it was just handed to him, all of this. And I was the one always talking about it and always wishing for it. But in hindsight, it was perfect the way it worked out for him. Because as a guy, he didn't talk about it much, and he may not have ever searched for them. And so thank God they sought him out. And what a perfect scenario that they were together. They had more children. And now I imagine it was probably so hard for Hugh to go there and think this is where I could have been raised. And the fact that he wasn't, I'm sure that was very difficult for him.
Yeah, it must have been. Just briefly, because this story is about you, but what was it like for you to sit there and watch his biological father walk through your door and spend time with you?
It was amazing. And I remember they went out for drinks that evening, and my dad brought them up to the pub. And Hugh met all of his buddies, and he said, "Well, here's my dad, and here's my other dad, and no, they're not gay." And all the friends laughed, and I'm sure it was just mind blowing for Hugh's friends. And I remember hearing them come in late that night, and I thought, this is it. I wished I could just eavesdrop and see what do they talk about, especially when they've had a few drinks. And I tried to listen through my bedroom door. And in all honesty, they're Irish men. Like they probably just talked about, motors and tools and things. Nothing emotional. They're both very quiet. So, but it was really beautiful to see them together.
I bet it was. Can you describe then
That's-
how you, well, before we go any further, tell me about your family. How did you get along with your brother and your adopted parents? What was your family like?
Oh, beautifully. I mean, my parents were my best friends, very, very close. I always think, if I ever kind of doubt the flow of the universe or what's meant to be, I just think about the fact that I could have been with anybody, and I was placed with my parents, and the bond that we have is just incredible. I mean, we are so close, and we had a great life. I mean, they were excellent parents, and Hugh and I get along really well. We were just given a really good life. I don't think there's anything that I could have complained about. We
That's
were
awesome.
very, very close. Yeah.
That's awesome. I like to hear that
Mm.
because a lot of times, especially in the space that you and I are in, there's a lot of negativity about the adoption experience. And I
Yes.
like to have balance because there is balance in this. We sometimes focus
Yes.
on the challenge of an adopted person going into a family where they didn't fit. And a lot of what this platform is about is dispelling the myth that an adopted family always fits together, but sometimes it does. And I love to hear that people who adopted had love to give and the family worked and that the adoptee felt comfortable and loved. And so I love to hear that you've said that you were best friends with your parents. That's just,
Oh,
I
absolutely.
like to
Yeah.
hear these kinds of stories. So I appreciate you sharing that.
Yeah. I mean, we were absolutely loved and never doubted. Yeah, we were, I think we both, were sort of raised very securely. There was never a doubt. And our bonds were really strong. I mean, my dad, I went everywhere with him as a kid, and he said I was the most worldly little kid, as if I'd been here before. And I just think it's so remarkable that they, for 8 years, they never discussed adopting until that moment. And that's when they were ready. And that's when Hugh and I came along. And we kind of hit the jackpot, I think, in every sense.
Every time they visited Ireland as a family, Pippa loved it. Her family found it hard to tear her away from their homeland trips to return to their home in California. She told me she felt more at home in Ireland than she did in the States. Watching Hugh's journey was a catalyst for Pippa to find her family of origin, people she had always wondered about. So, when Pippa told her family she was moving back to Ireland at 19 years old, they weren't surprised. They were supportive, and her family hoped she would find the connections and answers that she longed for. When Pippa arrived, she called Hugh's mom and
As soon as she answered the phone and knew I was living there, she said, "Right, you'll come for Christmas." And I said, "Oh, all right." And so I had this whole other family to get to know. And I spent so many weekends and holidays with Hugh's family, and they got to know him through me. I could tell all the stories that Hugh, as a 19-year-old man, would never tell. So it was a beautiful introduction to their family as well.
Pippa was very lucky for how her search unfolded. She contacted a social worker at the adoption agency, the same agency Hugh had been adopted through, and they started the process of finding her birth mother. Pippa said she was surprised at how quickly the search had gone. She also talked about how her adoptive parents had maintained contact with the adoption agency to keep them up to date on where their family had moved throughout the years.
And, one thing I should add is my parents, over the years, we moved a couple of times in the States, and my mom wrote to the adoption agency each time to update our address. And at one stage, we were actually going back to Ireland for a holiday, and my mom wrote and said, if the children's families would like to just meet us in a public park and just see them and know that they're healthy, that they're happy, and just see them from far away, I would be open to that. And of course, it's a closed adoption and that would not be allowed, but it just shows how willing my mom was to make this easier on all parties.
That's really awesome.
Yeah, my parents were very empathetic towards Hugh's family and my family, and what a loss it was for them.
When Pippa found out how close her birth mother had lived to their home in West Ireland, she was shocked. Pippa dove into the story of meeting her birth mother, so I had to catch her to help her share more about the fact that she was just a young woman who had moved around the world on this identity-defining search.
Just a lovely person, very easygoing, very excited to meet, very open to telling me anything I wanted to know. Immediately she offered, kind of medical history. She was just an open door and open arms. And so I then got in touch with my birth father through her.
Let's pause for a quick second because we're going to
Sure.
just blow right by everything here. So you're in Ireland. You're 19. Let's not lose sight of that fact, right?
I know, I was a baby.
You were just a kid still. Like, you haven't really figured out who you are. And here you are on this voyage across the globe to try to figure part of that out. And you've been introduced to your biological family. Tell me a little bit about the getting to know each other part before you actually met. So the social workers sort of figured out who
Sure.
each of you were. Tell me a little bit about the lead up.
Sure. Once the initial letters were exchanged, I met with the social worker at a cafe, and that was the day that she was really going to tell me the first kind of chunk of information about the circumstances of why I was given up and a little bit about both parents. And we met at this cafe, and she said, "Now, Pippa, I must ask, do you like cats?" And I said, "I'm sorry?" And she said, do you like cats?" And I said, "Gee, sure, yeah, I like cats. Never really thought about it." And she said, "Well, I must say, your mother very much enjoys cats. She currently has 26. And I said, "Oh, Jesus Christ." So she was the village cat lady. That was kind of the first bit of information. And I said, "Oh dear, okay, go on. There must be more." So we sat at this cafe, and she said, "Now, do you mind if I just record you saying something to your mother? Because all this time she sort of presumed you had an Irish accent, and now here you've grown up in America." And that was quite a shock to her. And so I remember she recorded me, and I was kind of, nervous and playing with the salt shaker. And so I left her a message about her cats. And, I just kind of said, "Really looking forward to meeting you and all of these cats." So she told me about my mother and father and sort of how they met. They were young, they were in school, they were madly in love. And it was interesting because I never really thought about him. My focus was always on her. So it was such a treat to know that I could meet him as well. And I'll just backtrack. Actually, when I first got in touch with the social worker, she said, "Okay, give me until next Tuesday, and I'll see if I can gather some information give me a call, say 10 o'clock in the morning on Tuesday. And so I was working at this school and I couldn't wait to run downstairs, and I used the payphone in the cafeteria. And this is before, we even had euros. We were down, we had the Irish pound. So I put in my coins in the payphone and I spoke to her, and she said, Pippa, I have some really good news. I've contacted both your mother. I've contacted your mother, and she's very, very excited to meet you. And she will get in contact with your father, who was also excited to meet you. And I remember getting off the phone in that empty cafeteria, and the cooks were just kind of cleaning up from breakfast. And I looked around like, God, who can I tell? I had nobody to talk to. And I worked upstairs in this office on my own, and there was no internet. I couldn't contact home. I couldn't contact anybody. And I sat with this information all day. And, it was just incredible to know, first of all, that they were alive, and second, that they were willing to meet, because those were my biggest hurdles. I always had that fear that maybe they would be dead. Maybe they wouldn't be open to meeting. And so I took 2 buses home, and I remember being on the second bus, and there was this little elderly woman beside me, and every time the bus turned, we'd kind of lean into each other and smile, and she just seemed like a nice woman. And eventually I just couldn't stand it anymore, and I looked at her and I said, excuse me, could I tell you something? And she looked up and she said, of course you can, love. And I said, okay, so, and I just rattled off the story, and and she was in tears by the end, and she said, God, this is just incredible. And by the time she got off the bus, I mean, she was fully crying, and she was wishing me the best of luck. And she stood there waving at me until the bus was out of sight. And I'm waving back through the bus window, and I was just so relieved that I could share it with somebody. And oh, it was so exciting. And so
It's so funny to
then,
just hear, it's funny when you get to this moment of having news and you're bursting. You just
I
want to
just
shout it out
couldn't
loud.
take it.
Yeah. Oh my
I
God.
just couldn't. And she
You
was
just
so
turn to a
lovely. And I'm
stranger.
sure
That's
she
so
always
cute.
wondered, how is that girl on the bus?
I
How did
know.
it
I
go?
was thinking that too. Like, you just waved
Yeah,
and she disappeared and the bus disappeared, and she's probably wondered about you for so long. Oh my gosh.
yeah.
Wow.
And then my mom too, she worked in a hospital in California, and she said all of her coworkers were, constantly asking her, what's the news? Any updates? What's the progress? And even Patty, she worked in a shop in this small town, and she said that people were double parked in the road running in, asking her, how's it going? Any updates? People love a good story, and
Mhm.
there's nothing better than a good adoption story that it all works out. It's really heartwarming for people that are not even connected. It's a beautiful thing to see that sort of healed.
So the social worker helped Pippa and her birth mother exchange letters. Then they exchanged addresses, and finally, they shared their phone numbers.
And we got to speak on the phone, and Patty had such a beautiful accent. It was a very soft, kind of blended accent. She lived in Paris for a number of years,
Hmm.
so she was not just an Irish country accent. It was kind of a blended accent. But it was incredible to speak to her and to plan our meeting. And she told me a little bit about my birth father and the circumstances there. And it was nice to just know that they were young and madly in love. And that was comforting to think, well, at least no matter what happened, I was conceived in love. And that was important to me.
Yeah, it is. It's very comforting to know, because there's so many adoptions that come from some level of adversity. And
Yes.
many conceptions start in love, but it's the adversity that comes after the public perception,
Right.
the parental pressure, whatever the self-doubt, or the talk from the doctor, the coercion. A lot of times adoption starts from a great place in terms of the conception and the love. It's the aftermath of that, when the pregnancy is discovered, revealed, that all of this other external pressure comes in But still, knowing that you started from someplace positive can be really, it can complete people in a way that I think they don't necessarily, they can't calculate before they know that, you know?
Yes, yes, I found it very comforting.
Before their meeting, Pippa's birth mother Patty wrote her a beautiful letter explaining her relationship with Pippa's birth father John and the decision to place her for adoption. They had been madly in love, but John was a bit wild. Patty was pregnant for 7 months, hiding her growing belly under loose clothing until one day she was headed out the door to meet John to go fishing. Patty's mother, Pippa's granny, tossed open her sweater, revealing Patty's pregnant belly. In a panic, Patty raced out the door to go meet John for their fishing trip.
And both of them then told me their version of that day. And they both said, "Oh, Jesus, we didn't catch a single fish." And I said, "Oh, God, never mind the fish. How did you face going home after that?"
Right.
You know, so she knew she had to face the music. And her mother, my granny, who's still alive, she's so wonderful. I adore her. She said, "Look, I will keep your baby. I will raise the baby as my own, and you can still go off to college and get an education." And at the time, my granny had a 5-year-old daughter. The youngest was 5. So it would have seemed pretty natural for her to raise me. Nobody would have guessed, you know? But Patty thought long and hard about that. And she knew that if John was around and knew somebody else was raising his baby, he wouldn't be okay with that. And John was already kind of a drinker, and he had a bit of a temper, and it just wouldn't have gone well. And Patty knew that he was not able to be a father. He wasn't mature enough, and he couldn't be a provider. And so ultimately she came to the decision on her own that adoption was best. And her mother insisted that they keep me and raise me. And Patty said no, it just wouldn't work. And I remember hearing from my mom then that that was the stipulation with adopting me. My parents were told the grandmother would really like to raise Pippa. And my parents were so afraid that at some point my granny could take me. You know, she could change her mind for a period of up to like 6 months. So it was stressful for my parents when they did eventually get me, because they knew the family really wanted to keep me. But Patty knew deep down it was just best. She couldn't sit back and watch somebody else raise me.
Yeah.
And she knew John definitely wouldn't sit back and watch that. So I think that was a really mature decision as a 19-year-old. She definitely did the right thing and definitely gave me a better life, a much better life. I can't imagine the circumstances if John was involved. It was absolutely the right decision. So thank God she had the wits about her to make that decision.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a significant level of sort of emotional intelligence and situational awareness at a young age and in crisis, right? As a young
In
pregnant
crisis,
woman.
yeah.
Yeah. That's impressive. And I'm glad you feel
It
like it was the
is.
right decision, because a lot of
It
folks
is.
question, they see what the possibility could have been and the desire to have been with their birth mother regardless. And we would have made it through, being the sort of mentality. I can appreciate why people do want that, but I can also appreciate how it was the right decision for the birth mother at the time. And you have said that you're thankful for the life that you've lived. So, you know, everybody's
Oh,
story
so
and
thankful.
situation is different, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then, Patty explained a little more about her relationship with John. And she said that after I was born, she was sent to a mother baby home, and she was there for several months. And John tried to go down and see her, and the nuns would not let him in. They were obviously not married, and he was the enemy. So the nuns really turned him away as soon as he arrived. So she was in this home and gave birth to me, and she watched I was christened there. She watched the christening, and that was it. And she had to leave then. And she eventually returned back home, and John would try to write her letters, and she would intercept them with the postman. And, her family definitely didn't want any correspondence between them, but they were determined. So, and I love that kind of romantic era of, writing these long letters, and she would run out and intercept it. But one of the letters he wrote, he said, look, we can never have our baby, but we could still be together. We could start a new life. We could go to England, and at least we can have each other. And he said, meet me at, a certain date at this restaurant, and let's start fresh and let's go. And Patty had that letter for about a week, and she was debating, do I go? Do I not go? And she knew by going that would cause a tremendous amount of turmoil in her family. But she was young. She was in love for the first time. And in the end, she decided she was going, and she packed her bags for England. And she woke up that morning prepared to meet John. However, she woke up with meningitis. And she was rushed to emergency, and she was sick for quite a while. And as it turned out, John went to that restaurant. He waited, and he revved up his car, and he took off, and he went to England. And he's lived there ever since. And he didn't know for 20 years why she never showed up.
Oh my gosh. Are you
Until
serious?
I met
That's
him.
crazy. Wow.
And I told him. And it was so interesting because Patty told me her version of the story. And, she just presumed she's from a small town. It's a small community. Somebody knew she was sick. Somebody would have told John. And it was one of Patty's friends who saw John at the restaurant, saw him rev up his car and take off. And she remembered thinking, God, John is very upset about something. Nobody ever told him.
Yeah.
It just never came up. So Patty told me her version, and when I met John, he told me his version, and his version sort of stopped. And I said, but John, you she was sick and the meningitis, and she was in emergency, and a tear just rolled down his face, and he said, I never knew.
John spent 2 decades thinking his young love, Patty, had stood him up on his offer to start a new life together. In the wake of her illness, Patty led a difficult life, dealing with a lot of loss. She had carried her daughter, gave birth to her, witnessed her christening, then relinquished her to be adopted. The young man who loved her, acknowledged their daughter was gone, but who still wanted to start over somewhere else with her, had been stood up when she got sick, and he was gone too. Years later, Patty moved to Paris for nearly a decade. She needed the freedom from her past and to escape the judgment of being a young, unwed mother. Patty eventually told Pippa that she loves Paris the way Pippa loves Ireland. Pippa told me she met her birth father John before she met Patty, but she met them both on the same weekend. He was living in England, so he traveled to Ireland for the weekend to stay at his sister's house in Dublin. Fortunately, Pippa had a friend who moved from the United States to Dublin, so she had an anchor of support from someone who knew her well, and he stood as her rock through the reunion. Pippa, nervous and anxious, took a taxi with her friend to John's sister's house. Once again, Pippa was bursting over the story of what she was about to do, so she couldn't help sharing her journey so far and the purpose of the taxi ride with the taxi driver. To that point, the driver had only been making small talk, but by the time Pippa finished sharing that she was about to meet her birth father, the taxi driver said,
Jesus Christ, he said, so I'm dropping you to meet your father. You've never met him. Oh, Jesus. And so he dropped me off, and I almost felt guilty, like I didn't invite him in for a cup of tea because he was so emotionally invested, And it just...
You're just leaving people hanging all over the place. This is crazy,
did,
Pippa.
but I just had to, and I just think, it's why not share that? I mean, we made his morning. He couldn't believe it, and he was almost in tears too.
Mhm.
And he was wishing us the best of luck, and he said, God, you never really hear stories. You hear so many that are so painful, and to know that here he is, so welcoming, and he's standing here with open arms, and you get to build a life together and get to know one another. He said it's just beautiful.
Mhm.
And so again, he was waving as he drove off. And so we arrived at John's sister's house, and I walked into the house, and it was overwhelming how many people were in this house, and everybody kind of shook my hand. And I remember shaking John's hand and thinking, is this him? Because there were other men in the house, and I was just so overwhelmed at the amount of people that I had to meet. And I remember shaking his hand and thinking, oh, it's him. This is him. And everybody was nervous, and drinks were being poured. And, after a couple of drinks, we were all so relaxed, and I was just staring at him. And it was a fun day, lots of fun stories, but a big emphasis on drinking. And as it turned out, that was kind of the theme with John. And I got to know him for almost 2 years, from 19 to 21. And over those years and months, I did spend a lot of time with John, but drinking was a big part of it. And it became a very negative part of us getting to know one another. But I did get to meet all of John's family, his mother. I mean, she was delighted to meet. She was a lovely person. And I met John's siblings, his nieces, nephews. So it was a great beginning.
That's incredible. How was it to look in his face? Like, could you see elements of yourself in this person?
Funny, I didn't see a resemblance at all. He's tall and skinny, and that's probably the only thing that we share. But I didn't see a resemblance. And with Patty, I saw a lot of resemblance. I saw our nose, our facial structure, our ears, but I didn't see a whole lot with John. But the first night I was out with John, we just stayed out way too late, drank way too much. And I was still very young. I was too young to be drinking that way. And I remember at the end of the night, we all returned to John's sister's house, and everybody went to bed. And I was really anxious to go to bed too. And John wanted to stay up and talk. And he was very drunk and very emotional. And, he was kind of holding my hand, and he was looking at my fingers, and he was saying, God, your hands are so like Patty's. Everything about you is so similar. And it was too much. It got pretty uncomfortable. And I remember saying, look, I really need to go to bed. And he just kept hugging me. And I remember him hugging me, and all of a sudden I said, oh, I have to stop. I'm going to be sick. And I started to vomit, and I vomited on him. I vomited into the kitchen sink. And I remember thinking, God, my first day meeting him, and I'm vomiting on him. This is terrible. This is like disgraceful. But it was that was the extent of the drinking. I mean, it was sloppy drinking. And that was kind of normal for John. And for me, it was very uncomfortable. And I remember thinking, at least when I was vomiting, it was my out. It was just too much for me. I hit my point of I needed him to let me go and let me get to bed. But he was a very emotional drinker, and it just got a little messy. Yeah. And I really didn't like that. And growing up, when we were growing up in California, my dad was sober. And that was part of the reason we left Ireland to come to California. Part of it was the economy, but the other part was my dad was drinking. And he didn't want to be a drinker and raise kids. And he didn't know if he could stop drinking in Ireland. So when we moved out to California, he got sober. And so I grew up with a sober father. And then to be faced with meeting John and having this very emotional connection, but then combined with all the booze, it kind of disturbed me. I wasn't used to grown men being that out of control. And it was very uncomfortable. And I had never seen my dad drunk. So to see this new person in my life being so sloppy and so drunk, it was very, very uncomfortable. And it disturbed me a lot. But at the same time, I was young and I was drinking, and it was kind of the norm. But it definitely triggered something in me that I hated. So
yeah. I can imagine there's a natural thing that happens. There's this, here's the father that I grew up with. Let me see how this other person, and you don't mean to, but compares. And something as
Yes.
wildly opposite as sober versus emotionally drinking all the time is very tough to deal with. And especially as you've said, like it was so much that it was problematic for you guys in the aftermath is
Yes.
it's a lot to deal with when trying to get to know somebody that you're biologically related to. But it also sounds like that
Yes.
emotional drinking was like at least a piece of it is your return and his connection to his past and this long lost love and the slight of not of being stood up at the bar and everything
Yes.
flooding back.
Yes.
Wow.
Yes, exactly. And I remember the first night that I met John, we met at his sister's, we had a few drinks, then we went out to a restaurant. And I remember my dad calling. He knew exactly what time we were meeting. And he called at the perfect time. We were just walking into the restaurant. And Dad said, "Could I speak to John?" And I said, "Oh, of course." And I said, "John, my dad wants to talk to you." And I could hear my dad through the phone say, "Well, how do you think I did?" And John started laughing and he said, "Jesus, how did you do? You did beautifully. I mean, she's incredible." And I just thought, wow, this is so amazing that they're speaking on the phone. And I was so happy to have my dad's voice there with me at the restaurant because of course I was so nervous.
Right.
And to know that on the other side of the world, mom and dad were sort of with me in spirit and kind of cheering me on the whole way.
So that was the interesting first night between John and Pippa. John was living in England and he had a girlfriend for more than a decade. Pippa wanted to go and see what John's life was like in England with his girlfriend and the woman's 4 daughters. The rest of the story of her broken-hearted birth father, whose romantic story had abruptly ended, was something Pippa wanted to see. She said John's girlfriend was a lovely woman and they had a well-established, settled life. John's girlfriend, recognizing the lack of closure John had from their past, even said she'd be open to John and Patty seeing one another because they had never had a chance to close their relationship if that was what was needed. Pippa, forever the optimist in her words, thought perhaps she could reunite everyone, have a party, and everyone could meet and see each other. Pippa's family had been receptive to Hugh's reunion, so they were on board. Patty and John's families were on board as well. Pippa set the date for a party at her home in Dublin.
Initially, it was pretty exciting. Everybody was delighted to see each other. And John's family had always really adored Patty and kind of wanted them to get together. So they were happy to see her again after years of not seeing her. From the time I was born, John and Patty had only seen each other once. And that was, I believe it was at John's uncle's funeral. And they just met in passing for a minute. And John said to Patty, "If she ever finds you, please promise me that you'll let me know." And Patty said, "I promise you. I'll contact you immediately." And that was it. So here we are 20 years later in Dublin, and everybody came together. John came from England. He brought his girlfriend. He brought 2 of his girlfriend's kids, and they were all staying at my house. So Patty and her family came. Everybody came together, and it was incredible to all be under the same roof. And we got pictures of us. So there's pictures of Patty and John and I together. And what a trip, to see us together, the 3 of us.
That
But
must have been,
unfortunate.
just to have this
Oh,
pause for a quick second, like you
sure.
have been the unifying force for these folks who haven't seen each other in decades and have wanted to have unresolved issues. And it's like, it's helpful for you. You get to see these 2 people together who loved each other and are the reason why you're on this planet. And it fulfills, like, you have moved across the globe to try to make something happen, and it's happening in spades. That must have been just really magical.
It was so magical. It really was. And also by coincidence, a friend of mine, another friend from California, was living in Dublin studying film. So she came to the party and she never went anywhere without her video camera. So she's bouncing around and she's got the whole thing on video. And it was incredible to, she's videotaping John's mother asking, like, how does it feel having Pippa back in your life? And, I still have all the videos, it's incredible to relive that evening. However, the theme was too much alcohol. And by the time John even arrived at the party, he was very drunk. He took the ferry from England and he was really drunk. And at one point, I felt like the party was going well. I looked in the kitchen and there's John and Patty and they're talking away. And I just thought, wow, what a trip. Here they are, like in my kitchen, reunited and talking. Again, I think I was pretty naive in thinking this would just go so smoothly. And I looked over another moment and they're kissing in the kitchen. And my heart just dropped. And I looked over and I could see John's girlfriend sitting in the living room, her two children sitting there. And so I burst into the kitchen and I separated them and I said, this cannot happen. You have to stop. And John's sister was there. She was really in favor of them getting back together, of John and Patty getting back together, because she didn't want John living in England. She wanted John back in Ireland. And so his sister stepped in and pushed me out of the kitchen and said, this doesn't concern you. This is not your business. And, you know, I'm 19 at the time and petrified. And she was a big woman, big, tall woman, very forceful. But I stood up to her and I said, this does concern me. I said, his girlfriend is in the next room. The children are here. This is unacceptable. You can't do this. And again, she pushed me out and she said, this doesn't concern you. I didn't know what to do. I just didn't know what to do. And I went to my friend, the filmmaker, and we actually caught it on film where I kind of whispered to her, I said, I need your help. John and Patty are kind of making out in the kitchen and this can't happen. And she said, wait, what? She said, Pippa, isn't part of you just thinking this is incredible? My mother, my father, they're in the kitchen, they're making out. And I said, no, this can't happen. The children, they're right there. This just can't happen. And she didn't really do anything. So then I went to Patty's sister, told her what was happening. She barged into the kitchen. She took care of it immediately. She pulled Patty out. She was horrified. And she pulled Patty out into the entryway and said, Patty, get your act together. You cannot behave like this. This is so disrespectful. And Patty was immediately apologetic. She kind of, but you know, she was drunk too. And she had this look in her eyes like she was gone. She was sort of off in fairyland. And it just spiraled. And it ended up being an awful evening. John's family got very aggressive. And they were kind of a rougher crowd. And his sister barged in and she started shouting at Patty's sister. And at one point, I just physically put my body in between the two of them because I thought John's sister was going to like punch her. And I thought, oh my God, here I have Patty's family who are so proper and so kind. I think she's about to get punched. And I thought, you know, I'll take the punch. If anybody gets punched, I can't let them, you know. And what a crazy thing to even think about. So I just put myself in between them and it was a big, John's sister was shouting and it was horrible. Anyway, the evening ended. Patty's family whisked her away in a taxi. John's family left. His mother left, his sister, the whole family, and nobody said goodbye to me. I went to hug his mother and apologize for all the upset. And even his mother wouldn't look at me. She just walked out the door and I never saw them again. And that was 20 years ago.
Oh my gosh.
It was terrible. And John and his girlfriend and the two children were staying at my house. So his girlfriend took the two children up to bed. John stayed up drinking for hours and he was so out of it. I think he was kind of blacked out. He kept sort of coming to and saying, what was all the fuss about tonight? And I would say, Jesus Christ, John, what was the fuss about? Oh, so it was really awful. And I actually never saw John again.
Oh,
that was 20 years ago.
Jeez, that is crazy. Oh my gosh, what? We just talked about how magical it was, and the whole thing just fell off the stage into the crowd and vomited on itself. I mean, this is unbelievable.
It did, you know, and his mother was quite old, and I wrote to her a couple of times. I wrote her letters, and I said, I'm so sorry for what came about that night, and it was so wonderful meeting you, and I would love if we could get past this. And nobody in John's family ever responded, and she passed away, and So we never reconnected. But John stayed in touch with me over all the years, but his drinking just escalated and it just got worse and worse. And it got to the point where I hated hearing from him. You know, he would call me just belligerent, and I eventually said, I need you to stop contacting me. It's just too upsetting.
This was back when you were in Dublin, when you were 19, 20, 21?
You know, he contacted me for many years after that, but it was in recent years that I asked him to just stop. It was too messy,
Too much, yeah.
too much.
May I go back for a moment? We have focused a lot on John, and I just want to say again, I'm really sorry because it sounded like it was just going to go so well, and you must have had such high hopes at 19, but to see it all just really turn inside out and be very ugly must have just been so disappointing. Before the night of the big blow-up, Pippa and Patty had arranged to meet one another. Pippa said she was very nervous to meet Patty for the first time. Patty had taken a 3-hour bus ride from Swinford in the west of Ireland to Dublin in the east. Swinford was only a few minutes up the road from where Pippa lived in her youth. Her family had lived along the main road to get to the beach. So when Patty was going to the beach on the western shore as a young woman, she was traveling right past Pippa's childhood home. Prior to their reunion day, Pippa had only seen one tiny picture of Patty, so when she sat at the bus station, she examined everyone who disembarked the bus from Swinford. She remembers watching every person getting off the bus, wondering,
Is that her? Is that her? No, that's not her. No, that's not her. And eventually she was the last one to get off. And then I said, that's definitely her. And I had to fight the crowds at the bus station. And she just started sort of wandering around the bus station. And I was sort of running by the end to catch up with her. And eventually I caught up with her and I said, Patty. And she was deaf in one ear. So I really had to like scream at her. And then she turned around and she said, oh, sorry. And I said, oh, I've been chasing you. And we hugged and she said, God, that was awkward, wasn't it? I said, very awkward. And so she said, let's go and have a bite to eat. We walked through the city, just chatting away. And as soon as we stepped onto the road, I mean, she started to walk like directly into traffic. And I said, Jesus, Patty. And I had to like stop her from getting hit by cars. And she was laughing and she said, oh, yes, my sisters always tell me I should never come to the city because I have no awareness of, you know, city life. She's just used to, you know, a small little village. So she nearly died the first minute we met.
oh my
And
gosh.
but we laughed a lot. We went for lunch. We laughed. And then we went for a few drinks. And her sister Catherine came and joined us then for drinks. And I just didn't want the day to end. It was amazing to look at her. I saw a lot of physical similarities. I loved hearing her stories. You know, she had a lot of interesting stories. She had led an interesting life, a lot of years in Paris. She was a very worldly woman. She was just a very, very kind person. And I just couldn't wait for more. I just loved being around her. It was like immediately I could tell she just adored me and felt the same. It was just, we just longed for more.
Mhm.
And I spent a lot of time with her. You know, I would go visit her sort of every weekend that was possible. And she introduced me to everybody she knew. She was so proud. You know, she made a big fuss and a great effort to get to know me and to, you know, tell me about herself. And it was really lovely. She's a very, very sentimental person, as am I. And so, you know, when we weren't visiting each other, we would write letters endlessly. We documented a lot of our, you know, our first everything. She made me a calendar and it was like the first time I saw your photo, the first time I heard your voice, the first time you came to my home. She was just a really, really sweet person.
Wow. That's amazing. So
Yeah.
how long did you get to know her before this big moment of you all meeting together in this massive reunion? How long did y'all know each other before that?
Not that long, really. It was only a couple of months.
And what happened in the aftermath with you and her after that big, huge night?
Well, the aftermath with us was fine. I mean, she apologized for her behavior. She actually wrote to John's partner immediately and apologized and said that was so disrespectful and I'm so ashamed of my behavior. And it was all drink related and I got caught up with my emotions. And then the two of them became pen pals, which was so nice and so
Mhm.
surprising. And John's partner said, look, you were so young and you didn't have the opportunity. And I understand that and I get that and I wanted to support that. So thank God both women were able to sort of resolve that and respect one another after all that. And my relationship with Patty just grew and grew and grew. I thought it was sort of unfortunate that happened, but really meeting Patty's family was, I talk about hitting the jackpot, being adopted by my parents, then discovering the Brennan family. I mean, they're just, to this day, we're so close. I talk to Patty's sister almost daily.
Wow.
It's They're the most incredible family. I spend as much time as possible with them. They're all just really, really wonderful people. Just I couldn't have asked for a better family.
That's incredible. Wow.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I adore them. I just spent some time with them this summer. I really got so lucky finding them.
Hmm.
And with John, I'm so happy that I got to know him. I know where I came from, but unfortunately, I can't have the alcoholism. It's just too crazy. I told him if he ever decides to get sober, I'd love to have a relationship again, but I can't deal with that kind of stress.
Yeah. Alcoholism and substance abuse in general are just extremely disruptive on productive, healthy relationships. There's just no way
Yes.
around it. And
Yes.
it's unfortunate because my sense is were he to pull it together, you would be able to get past what happened and have a healthy relationship and one that you desire. And it seems like he does too. He's just drowning it
Yes.
with alcohol. And I'm sorry for that.
Yeah, it's a real shame.
When Pippa moved back to California, she stayed in really close contact with Patty and her family. Her parents even flew out and met Patty in Ireland, a moment that Pippa has pictures of. Everyone sitting around the kitchen table in the west of Ireland. Another amazing day in Pippa's reunion journey. We agreed Pippa had been lucky, as not all reunions progress with the closeness she has with her maternal side and the connection of her adoptive parents with her birth mother. Pippa and Patty were very close. They wrote letters often, called one another, and when the ability to text and email became available, Patty went to the local library to learn how to message Pippa through the computer.
When texting came about, Patty learned how to text, and it was like this beautiful love story. She was so proud. I was so proud to have her, and it was just this huge bonus to my life.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, at one stage, I was headed over to visit, and Patty's sister called me the day before I flew out, and she said, Pippa, we have to tell you Patty is actually really sick at the moment, and we had been hoping she would get better. She would be home from hospital before you visited, but that's not the case. And she is still in hospital, and you're going to see a big difference in her. And I was just blown away. And I said, what is it? And they said, well, it's sort of complications with her liver, but we really need you to be prepared. She's not looking good, and she hopefully will be fine, but it's going to be a big shock for you. And I just could not fathom, I had just received a letter from her. I wasn't prepared for her to be sick. And so I flew out the next day. We went straight to the hospital, and God, they were not kidding. She was not looking well. I'll never forget the elevator doors opened, and there she was waiting for me on the other side of the elevator. She was in a wheelchair, in a hospital gown. She was looking very ill. Her skin was all kind of jaundiced. Her eyeballs were like neon green tennis balls. I was just in shock. I was really, really in shock. And I sat down with her and we got some alone time. But even our journey from the elevator to her hospital room, it just seemed like everybody in the hospital knew her. And that shocked me. I just thought, how long has this been going on? Like, how does
Mhm.
everybody know her already?
Yeah.
And so it turned out she had been in and out of the hospital for a while, and it was alcohol related. So she also had her own struggles. And the doctor told her that visit, like, it could be literally one more drink that will kill you. Your body, for whatever reason, is not able. Your body can't handle this amount of alcohol and you will die. And Patty was petrified. And so she managed to stop drinking. And she stopped for 5 years. And I loved visiting her during those 5 years. I mean, she was so much more alive and vibrant, and she was traveling all the time, and she had the kids over all the time, her nieces, nephews. The kids came for slumber parties. She was just so much more alive, and she got to live the life that she hadn't been living, and I didn't even know she hadn't been living up to her potential. But during those years that I was visiting her, she was totally sober and she was doing well. She did try to go to AA meetings, but there was probably one meeting a week in her village. And she told me it was all men. And often the men would try to walk her home and she just felt too uncomfortable and she didn't go. So she had really no support. And eventually, after 5 years, she picked up again. It was immediate that she got sick. And her sister called me one day. I was in California and she said, Pippa, I'm ringing with some really bad news. Patty is in the ICU and things are not looking good. And shortly after, her other sister called and said, I'm ringing with some really bad news. And I said, no, I already heard what's happening. What are they saying? What can they do? And she just started sobbing. And she said, Pippa, I'm so sorry. She didn't make it. And I mean, I just could not breathe. I just couldn't fathom. This was so quickly that I had received all this information. And as it turned out, she was brought into emergency and she went in. She walked onto the ambulance and they brought her in and they started running some tests. And it was pretty immediate. Just her organs started shutting down one by one. And ultimately, she had a heart attack and she died.
Oh, I'm
And
so
it
sorry.
was just, I mean, I could not, I was in complete shock. I remember just looking out my living room window. I was shaking. I couldn't fathom. And at the time, I was 29 and I just, I just, it wasn't registering. And immediately I tried to book a ticket to go home for her funeral. I got into that kind of mode of like, just what's the next step? What do I do? How do I get there? And it turned out my passport had just expired. And I tried to get an emergency passport, but I couldn't get one because I couldn't prove she was a blood relative. And her funeral came and went, and I couldn't be there.
Oh.
And I was devastated. But the other thing, that day, as soon as I got the news, I called my mom at work and she started crying and she said, Pippa, I'm coming home immediately. And I said, no, don't come home because I knew she carpooled with some friends and she would leave somebody stranded. But I loved that that was her immediate response is like, I'm coming. And my dad said the same thing. I'll be right there.
Yeah.
And I just loved that. But, days passed and the funeral came, went, and I wasn't there. And I was so miserable and I felt so sorry for myself. And I just thought, this is it. I'm her only child and I can't be there. And the other piece of the puzzle is I was drinking a lot. So by this time I was 29 and I knew for years that my drinking was an issue, but I was sort of unwilling to look at it. So for the next 2 months, I drank more heavily than ever. And it was that kind of pitiful drinking, like just poor me. Here's my circumstances. Why did I get to find her? And I had 10 magical years with her and now she's taken from me. And ultimately, I was looking at it from a very selfish perspective. Poor me, poor me. And after about 2 months, I started to see the effects that her death had on everybody, and particularly her mother, my granny. And I just thought, God, my granny never drank her whole life. Her husband never drank. They hated alcohol and they hated the effects that alcoholism had on families. And here was my granny burying her firstborn. That's not fair. And I started to look at the effects that my drinking had on my family. And I thought, God, I'm 29 and she's dead at 49. Why am I any different? I could be dead so young, and my poor family would have to watch that. And so I knew I had to get sober. It was life or death. And I did. So that was June of 2011. I had my last drink. And that's, for me, that's amazing. I mean, that's a miracle. And that's the gift of this story, is that Patty's death ultimately gave me such a better life. If I carried on the way I was drinking, I would probably be dead, honestly, by now. I have the gene. I think I was born with it. I had it from both sides. I don't think I stood a chance. And, I watched my dad. It took a lot for him to get sober. It took leaving his home country, starting a whole new life. He made so many sacrifices so he could be a better father to Hugh and I. So I knew what to do and I knew it was possible, and I got sober. And I got to go back to Ireland at 4 months sober and show up for Patty's family. And I always think, what a miracle that was. What a miracle my passport had expired and I couldn't go back when I was drinking, because I would have made it all about me. I would have been sloppy. I would have been drinking and been emotional, and it would have been ugly. And here I was going back at 4 months sober, and I remember sitting up with my granny. We stayed up till midnight talking one night, and I talked to her a lot about AA and how essential it is for somebody who is alcoholic to have the support and have meetings and have people to connect with. Like, it was a miracle that Patty stayed sober for 5 years. The fact that she didn't have meetings, she didn't have that other component of support. No wonder she drank again.
Yeah.
Most people do. Only like 5% of alcoholics worldwide get sober and stay sober. Addiction is huge. And I got to talk to my granny about the people that I've met in recovery and the ways that they've helped me and all the miraculous stories. And I feel like I was able to give her a sense of relief, because of course, as a mother, she was thinking, God, did I do everything? Why didn't I send her to one more rehab? Why didn't I admit her to the hospital earlier? And I'm sure she carried a ton of guilt, as did Patty's siblings, but it wasn't up to them. And I remember her looking at me at midnight that night, and she just said, wow, this is all so interesting. And I really think that I was able to relieve a lot of her pain and her guilt, and what a gift.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, you're right. Wow. First, let me just say, I'm glad you found your way to sobriety for years and years. To be part of the 5% globally that makes it to continued sobriety is really, really awesome. And I want to just commend you for that. And I'm glad that you recognized it. It's sad that it had to come from Patty's death, but I mean, I think who better than she to have given you this lesson? Am I right?
Yes. Oh, absolutely. And I feel like it's such a tribute to her.
Yeah. Yes, that's what I
Every
was going
year,
for. Yes.
every year that I'm sober, I collect my sobriety chip and I bury it in her grave. And so now there's 11 chips buried there. And it was interesting because just recently my granny was there and she was cleaning the grave, and she found a load of my chips. And she asked Patty's sister, she said, what are all these tokens here? And she said, oh, did you not know those are Pippa's sobriety tokens? She brings them every year. And my granny was just thrilled. I mean, she was like gushing with pride. And I think that's really, it's full circle. Now I get to show up every year and honor her struggles. And it's amazing. It's it's a whole different life. And in some ways, Patty gave me life twice. She gave me a better life by choosing adoption. And all of her struggles in sobriety and in addiction really brought me to sobriety. So it is such an honor, and it is a really nice tribute to her.
That's amazing.
And it's a happy ending.
A happy ending. So many of us love one. But Pippa said that wasn't actually the end of her story at all. The year 2020 was 11 years after Pippa's birth mother, Patty's, death. While 2020 was really challenging for so many people as a global pandemic took lives and forced a restructuring of our normal way of life, Pippa had something incredible happen.
I got a message from a cousin of mine who lives in the UK. And this cousin said, Pippa, I have been contacted by a young lady who lives in Paris, and I believe she is your sister.
Wow.
And
Wow.
I was flabbergasted. And immediately I thought, well, there's no way. And she said this would be a sister through your mother. And I thought, oh God, wouldn't that be amazing? But that can't be right. I knew Patty. I knew her so well for 10 years. We were such good friends. There's no way she could have had another child and not told me. And this woman, my cousin, said, I understand this will be a tremendous shock to you, but I've spent a good amount of time doing the research, figuring out how this young lady ties into our family. And I am actually certain that she is your sister through your mother. And she said, if it helps, I can send you a photograph. And she sent me a photograph. And I remember just a tear rolling down my cheek. And again, it was like it took my breath away. She looks so like Patty and so like me. She's like the Parisian version of both of us, Initially, I was just so upset. And I remember I just started crying and I just started thinking, God, like Patty has missed all of this. Like she missed me. She's missed 10 years of me now. And now there's this whole other person that we never knew about. And she's gone and she won't ever meet this girl.
Mm-hmm.
And it was so upsetting. It was 11 years after her death.
Okay, thanks.
And I just thought, God, she's missing so much life. It's so unfair. And I then got in touch with Naomi, my sister, and we started emailing back and forth. And so she grew up in France, and she would write me these long, beautiful emails in French. I would race home, Google Translate, write her a long, beautiful letter back, translate it to French, send it over. And this went on for weeks. And then one day she just started writing in English. And I said, oh, this is wonderful. You speak English. Like, why didn't you tell me? And she said, I'm so self-conscious of my English. And I said, your English is perfect. I mean, it's excellent. And we just developed this immediate connection. And she is so cool. This is honestly the greatest gift besides getting sober. I mean, this is the most incredible gift. I was 40 when I got the news. I have this sister. She's 30. And so last February, I flew to Paris to meet her. And she's married. She has 2 beautiful kids. I have 2 little nieces. I mean, they're gorgeous. They're just, what a gift. It's unfathomable. But, what was interesting is one of the first things Naomi asked me, she said, I have to ask, do we have any addiction in the family? And I said, oh, Jesus. I mean, I have it from every angle. And she said, yeah, I've always had this feeling that I was born addicted. And the truth is, she probably was. The years that Patty was living in Paris, she was a very heavy alcoholic. And I would imagine she probably didn't realize she was pregnant for a long time. And I think just based on events that occurred in Paris, it's highly likely that Naomi was born addicted, and she has struggled her whole life. And it's pretty incredible now to hear about Naomi's childhood. She was adopted by a lovely couple. She had everything she could have ever wished for, but she suffered. She really, really suffered. There was something she was running from her whole life, something that tortured her. And only now at the age of 30 is she figuring out what made her that way. And I said to her, this isn't our fault. We didn't ask for this. We didn't want this, but we have it, and we have to cope with it, and we have to find a way to live our life based on these circumstances. And it was very difficult for her trying to make sense of things at a young age, but now she can look back and say, okay, it's nothing she asked for, but it is something she has to address, and she has to find ways to cope. But I think it very much affects neurologically. I think about, like, Patty hid me for 7 months. So she never, she wasn't the typical mother who sat down. You would hope for a mother that could sit down and sing to you or read to you. But the fact that she had to hide me for so many months, there was a huge amount of stress that she carried, which, any pregnant mother with stress levels that high, then they've got all kinds of elevated levels of cortisol, and that's passed on to the child through the placenta, and that it does affect us.
Yeah.
So I feel that I was affected, and I really do believe in, adoption trauma and how that really affects us, how being removed from our parents can trigger our neurological systems, and that trauma is stored in our bodies, and it does create a fear or a feeling of unease, and that stays with us, and we don't really know what that is. I'm sure that I have that. I'm even more sure that Naomi had that. And I think Naomi's circumstance was much more severe because Patty actually hid that pregnancy from everybody.
Right. And this was
Naomi
the
did.
second one. And
This was the second
this
one.
is after she and John didn't connect, and John was probably, on her mind, vanished. And so she's
Yes.
both lost her baby, hidden her baby for an extended period, lost her baby as she has put you up for adoption, and you have now gone off into the universe. She's lost John, who has moved away, and they don't talk to each other for 20 years. And she's coping with all of it under stress and has gotten pregnant for a second time, finds herself in the same situation. Her cortisol levels must have been through the roof in terms of trying to deal with everything else, let alone
Exactly.
the alcohol addiction that she was probably living with and likely passed on to Naomi. That's a lot.
Huge. And what we discovered then when I got in touch with Naomi is Naomi has a couple of pages, her adoption paperwork. And it did say that Patty told nobody. She worked up until 2 days before giving birth. She stayed in the hospital for 3 days, and then she returned to work. But it did say that she had to give up the baby because the baby's father was not her boyfriend with whom she lived with, because he was sterile. The father was an Algerian Muslim, and we don't know who that is.
Oh, wow.
So she had a boyfriend. She was living with a boyfriend. And at some stage, he got deported. He was deported back to Algeria. But we don't know the timeline because we don't know about this Algerian Muslim. We don't know where he came from. We don't know why she was pregnant by him.
Yeah.
So that's a huge amount of trauma. And she carried that. And then that combined with her drinking, Naomi, she didn't stand a chance, really.
Yeah. But how fortunate that she was able to find you and be able to ask that question, even though her question isn't fully answered about who she is and what she comes from. Knowing you and knowing that you have at least some of the answers, and you've met your shared birth mother and can say, yeah, I've seen it firsthand. I come from it on both sides. That's That's got to be super helpful for her. And I'm glad that you were able to bring her to that. And
Really helpful. I mean, this is bringing so much peace to her world.
as we chatted about Naomi and Pippa's genetic links to addiction and the stress Patty was under when she was pregnant with each of them, Pippa referenced the book The Body Keeps Score, which is about the mind and body's connection to trauma. We talked about adoption trauma, the separation of a child from their mother and family, and how some adoptees never heal from the damage adoption trauma inflicts.
I think so many adopted people, they have a really hard time healing. And in my case, I was so lucky. I was so loved. It all worked out very well. I think I did heal that neurological trauma, but some people never get there. It's very difficult. And then when you think about addiction, and it's hard to know whether alcoholism, of course it is, it's a very sort of complex genetic disease, but it's soothing for a lot of us. And Naomi probably never knew what it was she was trying to soothe. And I think same with me, is I never knew what it was I was trying to soothe. But when I found something that did kind of soothe me, it worked. But it's, you wonder if so many people have this gene and just don't pick up a drink, and they then never experience the addiction. I'm just kind of fascinated by the way it works. Like I look at John, he's a mess. I look at Patty, she's gone. And then I look at me, and I'm a survivor, not only a survivor of kind of the alcoholism, but of the general neurological trauma.
Mm.
It's fascinating to me. But
Yeah, it is.
I'm so glad that we talk about it, because I think a lot of people that are still suffering, that primal wound that's kind of, they can't quite pinpoint what it is they're suffering from, but that will manifest as like a loss or general distrust or emotional behavioral problems. But I work as a primary school teacher, and I think that's why I love the work that I do, because I look at these children and I think like they are so vulnerable, and they have no idea why they act the way they do, why certain things trigger them. And thank God we're raised in a time where we can research all of these things.
Yeah.
Imagine all the people that were adopted so long ago, and, they're not, parents can't, there's no affection, there's no, it's just a different time. But I feel really lucky to have grown up in this era where we can research things, we can look at things, we have support for various things. And really all of us suffer from something in our childhood. There's something that happened that we wished happened differently, but we get to heal from it. Everybody's healing from something, really.
Yeah, that's right.
So I don't look at this as something that was unfortunate that happened to me. It's like we all have it, and thank God I know what happened and I can piece it together. And now for Naomi's sake, thank God she has us to tell the stories, and we can tell her about Patty. And the other part is, like, Patty was such an incredible person. She was so warm. She was so kind. She really never said a bad word about anybody. She was just had a solid heart. So it's hard to talk about her and talk about the alcoholism. She was so much more than that.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't feel respectful to focus on that so much. But I think it's really important to focus on it going forward, because like this summer, I got to meet Naomi in Ireland. I picked her up in Dublin, and we drove west together, and we met all the family. And she met our granny, our aunts, our uncles, our cousins, everybody. And they welcomed her with open arms, and they were just overjoyed. And at one point, Patty's sister even, she gathered some documents that she had belonging to Patty, her old passport, some old CVs, some letters of reference. And she said, Naomi, I would love to give you some things that belong to her. And then she kind of laughed and she said, I'm so sorry. Like, obviously we didn't know you existed. And, when Patty died, Pippa got to take some of her things, but we didn't know you existed. So we didn't know to save you anything. And then she laughed and said, God help us if there's a third one, because we'll really have nothing left to give her. But, and I love that because, it's a big shock, and some of the family, it was hard to wrap our heads around, like, God, we were sort of deceived.
Yeah.
But we weren't deceived because she chose to. We were deceived because she was in a state of trauma, and it was too painful for her to share this. And no wonder she drank, and no wonder she died. She had to carry a lot of secrets, and you're only as sick as your secrets. And she didn't stand a chance. And so it's when we got to the point where we could joke about it, that really made Naomi feel so much more welcome. And that's all we can do is laugh about it. Like, Jesus, here we have this beautiful addition to our family. And Naomi and I talk almost every day. So it's just been such a gift. And
Awesome.
It's funny when you think about the ways of the universe and how things work. I love to just sit back and remember, like, I am not in charge. There's somebody else orchestrating all of this, and it's beyond my wildest dreams.
Yeah. Really cool. Pippa, I'm so thankful that you were able to find Naomi. I think I think a lot of adoptees sit and wonder, like, who else might be out there? I was able to find these people, but who else might be out there? And for you guys to find each other and connect and bond and go back to Ireland together is really amazing. And I'm just really glad for you to have been here with me to share this journey. I'm excited for you to be on the other side of what started to be a bad bout with sobriety. And I'm excited for you and Naomi to go through the rest of your lives together. So thank you so much for sharing your story.
Yes, God, it's my pleasure. And even when I was in Paris this last February, Naomi and I got the address where Patty used to live, and we went to her old building, and just standing outside her building was just so moving. Here we were, the two of us standing here. Who would have ever thought? It's amazing. So yeah, lots to look forward to.
Awesome. Really cool.
Well, thank you so much, Damon, for taking the time. I know this was a very long-winded story.
That's all right. It was so fascinating. Oh my gosh.
It's a fun one.
I love this. Part of this work is to hear the stories of people's lives, and I appreciate you opening up. So thanks for being here with me. Take care. All the best. All right.
Okay. Thanks, Damon.
Take care, Pippa.
Bye.
Bye. Hey, it's me. Pippa watched her brother Hugh's reunion come to their house, so she decided to return to Ireland to start her own reunion journey. In Dublin, she was able to find her sweet birth mother Patty, who contacted Pippa's birth father, her long-lost love, John. When Pippa got everyone together for one big reunion, emotions were high and drinks were flowing, leading to inappropriate behavior that Pippa had not predicted. It was tough to hear that John's drinking put such an uncomfortable strain on Pippa's relationship with him. But I was also glad to hear about Patty's 5-year sobriety, even if it came after a hospitalization. I want to congratulate Pippa and everyone out there fighting for their own sobriety. I'm sure it's not easy, but it's so important for your health. It was such an unexpected twist to hear that Pippa had a sister in Paris named Naomi. I think we most often expect an unfound sibling to come forth on our paternal side, but I have spoken to a few adoptees who told me their birth mother had another child that no one knew about. I'm so glad Pippa and Naomi found one another, because without their connection, Naomi could have continued to struggle against the temptations of addiction without knowing why. I'm Damon Davis, and I hope you found something in Pippa's journey that inspired you, validates your feelings about wanting to search, or motivates you to have the strength along your journey to learn, who am I really? Just a quick reminder, you can follow me on Instagram at Damon L. Davis and follow the podcast at WAI Really. If you like the show, please take a minute to leave a 5-star review in your podcast app or wherever you get your podcasts. Your ratings really do help others to find the podcast too. And if you're interested, you can check out my story in my memoir, Who Am I Really? Available on Amazon, Kindle, and Audible. I hope you'll add my story to your reading list.